Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Deborah Thomas, and I am the director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography. And I'm super excited to welcome you to our second Visiting Fellows event, a discussion of Steven Feld's Hearing Heat. Hearing Heat listens to histories of listening to cicadas in Papua New Guinea, Japan, and Greece. And of course, we know that listening has been at the core of Steve's innovative practice for the past 50 years. So I'm going to take a little bit of time right now to introduce Steve, to introduce our respondents, and to lay out how this event will go. I couldn't have been more thrilled when Steve agreed to join us for a semester at the center. I came of age, anthropologically speaking, at NYU in the early and mid 1990s, where I was introduced to Steve's work by three different people: linguistic anthropologist Bambi Shefflin, cultural anthropologist Connie Sutton, and media anthropologist Faye Ginsberg. For many of us, Steve was a kind of a rock star, precisely because his work spanned so many different modes of attention. And while something called ethnographic film had long been a recognized category of work, the kind of professional genre-bending audio and visual work Steve was doing was unusual. Having inaugurated the field of acoustomology, which I will take the liberty to define as place-based ways of being and knowing expressed and experienced multi-generationally through sound, Steve's work has been foundational to the anthropology of sound and voice, to sensory ethnography and linguistic poetics, and to experimental modes of writing, recording, filmmaking, and publishing. His innovations have been recognized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and by the MacArthur and Guggenheim Foundations, among many others, and he has lectured or performed at some 150 universities, galleries, and museums worldwide. Steve Feld received his PhD in anthropological linguistics from Indiana University in 1979, having begun what would become a quarter-century-long collaborative engagement in the Bosavi Rainforest of Papua New Guinea. This work spawned several books, including the classic monograph Sound and Sentiment, which received the 1991 J.I. Staley Prize from the School of American Research, and which has been reprinted 3 times, a Bosavi English Tokpisin dictionary, and numerous essays and audio projects, including the CD Voices of the Rainforest, a 17-minute eco-rockumentary that was originally produced by Grateful Dead percussionist Mickey Hart, and which he recently re-released as a re-edited 7:1 soundtrack and immersive film. Voices is a kind of cinema concert structured around a day in the life of the rainforest, and it asks us to consider our eco-relationality with his Bosavi collaborators and with the region that has become known as the lungs of the earth. It also asks us to consider the legacies of colonialism, missionization, and extraction, both in relation to the changes in what, during a recent interview, Steve called, quote, sonic cohabitation, histories of listening, and the acoustomological world of 2 previous generations, end quote, and in relation to people's assessments of where they stand in relation to this world. In this way, Steve is asking us to account for and to be responsible for our complicities in these processes. Aside from being a filmmaker and a recording artist, Steve is also a musician. And in 2012, he published the award-winning Jazz Cosmopolitanism in Accra, 5 musical years in Ghana. Jazz Cosmopolitanism is another genre-bending publication, part ethnography, part biography, part music theory, and part memoir. The book charts his intimate engagements with music and musicians in Accra and issues important challenges both to conventional histories of jazz and the positioning of African musicians and race in relation to these histories, and to, excuse me, and to classical ethnographic approaches to Africa that downplay the forms of cosmopolitanism that permeate both urban and rural life. Steve's engagements in Accra generated several CDs and a DVD trilogy, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Across Train Station, and train is train like Coltrane, and A Poi Poi Funeral for Asharifye, as well as a double documentary DVD of 2 films, The Story of Poi Poi and MV Labadi, all of which actually predated the book, which itself resulted from Steve's reflections after the fact on his process of collaborating with the musicians on the audiovisual work. Our own Osea Lane, a scholar of the ways Jamaican popular cultural production is mobilized by dancehall artists in Ghana, who is now teaching at the University of the Arts, and who, as some of you may remember, performed his own compositions at our launch party. Osea assessed Steve's work in Ghana thusly. Feld aims to contribute to a cosmopolitanism from below, one that seeks to problematize less critical discourses of the redemptive possibility of any global communal solidarity imagined as cosmopolitanism, and one in which the differing socioeconomic, class, and linguistic backgrounds, both of Feld as a US researcher and of his chief informants, Ganaba, Norte, Anan, Nunu, and the Poi Poi truck drivers, reflect differing power locations in the global matrix, even as increased communication, travel, and most important, jazz, seek to bring communities closer together. I should also mention that a CD that Steve produced for Smithsonian Folkways recording, Poi Poi Horn Music of Ghana, became the US government gift to Ghana for the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of independence in 2007. Steve has been incredibly prolific throughout his career, and there are many other collaborative writing, photography, film, and audio projects I could elaborate here. But what I want to highlight as I bring this somewhat long introduction to the beginning of a close is his 2003 founding of Voxlux, a documentary sound art publishing label designed as an intervention into the strictures of scholarly publishing paradigms. Voxlux, in its short-run printing of packages that integrate audio, radio, podcasts, CDs, video installation, DVDs, photo essays, text, and other forms of multimodal scholarship. And I have an example of one here. There's a CD on one side, a DVD on the other, and you can see there's essays and photography throughout. These kinds of publications provide a professionally legible format for the publication of scholarly work that's rooted in creative practice. And this intervention is critically important to us as we attempt to find ways to institutionally legitimate multimodal practice as scholarly work that counts, not only for graduate students who are pursuing their research through multiple modes of attention, but also for young scholars coming up for tenure and promotion. This semester as a visiting fellow was meant to be a homecoming of sorts for Steve. After finishing his PhD in Indiana, Steve spent 5 years teaching visual and sound communications at the Annenberg School before moving on to teach at UT Austin, UT Santa Cruz, NYU, Columbia, and finally the University of New Mexico. When we initially spoke about the possibility of his coming to CEE, he was excited to be involved in a space he saw as bringing back the kind of interdisciplinary multimodal experience he had enjoyed at the Annenberg School of the early 1980s, to reconnect with old friends and to revisit some of his old stomping grounds, having grown up just outside Philadelphia. He designed a course called Anthropomedialities, Experimental Theory and Practice, which was meant to probe intermediality and multi-compositionality, that is, interacting textual, visual, sonic, and performative mediations, and to both theorize and assess the collaborative potential and representational affordances. After COVID hit, I called Steve to see whether he wanted to postpone his visit to us, given the new online dispensation. I was pleasantly surprised when he told me that this way of working would be more urgently relevant in COVID times, and that he wanted graduate students to have the skills to explore multiple channels for their own creativity and intellectual probing, as this could be what might give them important tools within a job market that will look considerably differently after the fact. He wanted to mentor the students as they developed their own multimodal projects and to work closely with them both as a group and individually. It has not been an easy semester for any of us. For Steve, I know the distance was difficult, that he wanted to be face-to-face in discussions, that he wanted to engage with folk in those serendipitous and unruly ways that develop when we're walking together to and from events or talks, or when we're sharing coffee or dinner, or when we're involved in each other's work. Nonetheless, generosity and a spirit of collaboration characterized Steve's semester with us. In addition to teaching the class, he organized a faculty seminar around the themes of intermediality and transmedia for members of the Penn community and beyond. This group met every other Friday to discuss one another's work, and Ellen Gray, a colleague at Dickinson College, wrote that this was time to, quote, luxuriate in sound, story, image, and the free play of ideas. She continued, "It has been such an enormous pleasure to have had the opportunity to learn more about some of the creative processes and the nuts and bolts that informed some of Steve's work in Ghana. I think I'm most grateful for the capaciousness that this seminar has opened up in terms of my thinking about ethnographic possibility and for expanding possibilities for the playful in the domain of what counts as scholarship." And I know that that is also what the students experienced of Steve in the class. All right, on to the main event. If you registered in advance for this seminar, you got a link to the video, Hearing Heat. And Hearing Heat was originally conceptualized to be an intermedial performance piece for installation in 6 to 8 rooms with variously positioned speakers and screens, presenting an experimental interplay of voices, acoustic biospheres, poesis, musical composition, film and television soundtracks, graphic design and notation, sonographic spectra, sculpture, and other material culture. But to accommodate the COVID dispensation, he retooled this as a 50-minute film that takes the shape of a kind of exhibit, walkthrough tour. So if you have not seen it as yet, we will put the link to the film with the password in the chat box. And it'll be up and available for maybe another week or so that you can view it. So today, assuming that many of you have had the opportunity to view it in advance, we will feature Steve in discussion with 3 of our colleagues, Christina Lyons, Jairo Moreno, and Greg Urban, and they will all offer brief responses to Hearing Heat. And after Christina, Jairo, and Greg offer their remarks, Steve will respond to them, and then we'll have a more free-flowing conversation, which will also open up to questions from the audience. So let me briefly introduce our respondents, and then I'll ask Christina to just go ahead and take it away. Christina Lyons is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. She also holds affiliations with the Center for Experimental Ethnography and the Latin American and Latinx Studies Program. Christina's current research is situated at the interfaces of socio-ecological conflicts, transitional justice, community-based forms of reconciliation, militarized ecologies, and science and legal studies in Colombia. She is a deeply sensitive and ethically grounded field worker and writer. Sorry, I live on Broad Street and there's always craziness going by. And Christina's commitment to holistic sensory ethnography has generated multiple forms of research and research output, which I think puts her at the forefront of multimodal anthropology. Her manuscript, Vital Decompositions, Soil Practitioners and Life Politics, was recently published with Duke University Press. Jairo Moreno is Associate Professor of Music. He is a music theorist, a critical historian, and an ethnographer who's interested in the production of knowledge of music and the sonic in modernity from a historic speculative perspective, the politics of aesthesis and Latin American popular music in the US during the long 20th century, and oral practices and imperial metaphysics among Afro-descendant and indigenous midwives in the Colombian Pacific region and in Northeast Brazil. His 2004 book, Musical Representations, Subjects and Objects, is a study of the history of listening in early modern and modern music theory and analysis. And next year, the University of Chicago Press will publish his Sounding Latin America, Hearing the Americas, Oral Equality, Migrant Creativity, and Syncopated Modernities. Jairo is also a bassist who has been nominated for 5 Grammy Award recordings with the late Latin and jazz percussionist Ray Barreto. Greg Urban is a linguistic and cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the forces that create, sustain, and transform culture. He's authored and edited a number of books, including A Discourse-Centered Approach to Culture, Native South American Myths and Rituals, Metaphysical Community, The Interplay of the Senses and the Intellect, and Metaculture, How Culture Moves Through the World. He's conducted field research among indigenous communities in Brazil and in global business corporations, and he currently edits the Journal of Business Anthropology. Okay, without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our respondents. Kristina, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Deb, for the invitation to comment on this beautiful and profound piece and the introduction. And thank you, Steve, for sharing this provocative and poetic work with us. I'm going to share my screen just so I don't do it later and interrupt what I'd like to say. There we go. So watching and listening to Steve's cicada remix, what he refers to as his cicada remix, made me think back to a few years ago when a sounds editor and music mixer friend and I placed contact microphones in different sets of soils in the Colombian Amazon. Soils compacted by hundreds of cattle hooves, others reforested pastures, primary forest and patches of wetlands or humedales. We listened intently, assuming that we would be able to hear something comparative, something indicative, detect the indexical sounds of degradation in contrast with stronger signals of vibrance. Surely life would manifest the harm wrought against it, and in turn its health and resilience. However, what we continuously heard during this exercise and later in the recordings was a pulsating throb in minuscule variation. At one point, my friend and I asked ourselves if perhaps we were not always listening to our own heartbeats. Was it an error in our use of the microphones that blocked our ability to get outside ourselves, we asked? Maybe this was indeed the very lesson of our Selva soil sounding exercise. Following Steve's suggestion, there is no outside or inside. There is pulsation that wanes and intensifies, always co-presence, intervocality and hence intercorporality without a necessary value judgment attached. Steve's piece reminds me of the proposal of a group of farmers I've accompanied for many years in the Colombian Amazon. They have talked with me about their plans to build what they call parlantes naturales, or natural speakers, to amplify the throbbing and buzzing cacophony that sounds from their polyculture gardens and orchards. These are farmers recovering Amazonian agricultural practices in what is mainly a sea of monoculture illicit coca crops, open pastures, felled trees for timber, and oil wells pumping crude out of the ground to be piped to the Pacific coast and carried away in tankers. Their idea is that life attracting life, life eating life, life shitting life, life decomposing into more life makes life happier. Not only the attraction of more bees, butterflies, birds, and crickets to their farms, but also the vital contagion that this acoustics could convoke, affecting neighboring farmers. The amplified reverberation would pique interest. It might move hearts. It could make the neighboring cattle suffering under the heat of an intense sun in a pasture without shade happier. They trust in the affective work that this reverberation might do, and starkly contrast it with the logics of imposed militarized development programs or externally funded and unsustainable aid packages, or simply trying to convince someone to make a transition away from extractive practices in the Amazon. Sound here is not only a way of knowing, but an invitation to unlearn and relearn, affecting one to risk transformation, risk initiating change, and reimagining how to inhabit the world, make a living, become part of a place or territory. Steve's piece, and especially the story of the cicadas in the selvas of Papua New Guinea, also reminded me of what philosopher Michel Serres refers to as a kind of parasite, static or noise. Similar to his grasshoppers in his book, The Parasite, that keep on singing and filling a space in their counterattack against the noise of chainsaw motors that attempt to cover and displace them from the forest, smaller pulsations of energy may become able to chase out bigger and more devastating ones. These pulsations may be able to perform potentiating endurance and resistive work until, of course, they can no longer, until they are disappeared, until they are silenced, until they have been eradicated or irrevocably displaced, becoming a different kind of absent presence or spectral presence, as Steve talks about. Steve's reflections on the sonic presences of cicadas in 3 different landscapes, their existence as sentient beings in Papua New Guinean forests, their affective signaling in mourning post-nuclear Japan, and the dense textual atmosphere of cicadas accompanying violent crowd chaos and street mobilizations in 1940s Greece are all deeply poignant reflections. However, I was most impacted by his provocation that perhaps it was cicadas who first felt the heat of the devastating atomic bomb released by the United States over Hiroshima in World War II. I was taken by what I have heard articulated in different ways as his notion of cicadas and other beings as biopolitical and political ecological archives. Nature is the memory of the world he learns with his interlocutors in Papua New Guinea. Or as my feminist science studies colleague Karen Barad has said, the world is its own memory. I am left with a set of questions about this memory, materiality, and the work that it can do or may do, in particular in regards to Steve's provocation. It seems that the throb of cicadas might beckon us to engage in reparative acts, or serve as a hauntological reminder or a premonitional warning of presences now or soon to be absent, along with the bundles of life that carry on or germinate in bombed out, cleared and scorched spaces. The other morning, after watching and listening to Steve's piece for the second or third time, I read the news of another assassination of an environmentalist in Colombia. This time of Javier Francisco Parra, an environmental coordinator for a special protected area of the country called La Macarena. In the news report, his co-workers affirmed that they will not allow anything to detain their work to curtail deforestation. All I could think about that morning were the cicadas and crickets, and if they bore witness to the hired killers. Their hum filling the air after Javier hit the ground, if he heard them in an unexpected last instant. Steve seems to suggest that cicadas also perform a sonic staccato, marking a singular plural death, even when they reverberate on or seasonally return. I'd like to ask him more about the recompositional possibilities he urges anthropology to engage in as it faces its deep mistakes and wounding past in our context of planetary climate change, increasing social environmental conflicts, and intensifying eradication of environmental activists around the world who are defending territories and life from extractivism, including the life of cicada populations. What role do acoustics, sounding, autoethnography, and for that matter, multimodal ethnographic practice play in this transformative work? What invitations are the cicadas he listens with trying to make if they're trying to do anything at all? I'd like to ask him to elaborate on the propositional politics of his cicada playlist or remix, and if he can talk more about his hopes for heightening acoustic attention. What are the stakes of acoustic cohabitation? Defending this cohabitance, and for whom?
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Center for Experimental Audiography, Deborah Thomas, Eliza Jordan, and Annie Linder, who have helped make this possible. To Steve, of course, for generously sharing his histories of listening with the Intermediality Working Group, and to members of that group, Ellen Gray, Eugene Liu, and Ilian Hill for their collegiality. And to my colleagues here at UPenn, Christina Lyons and Greg Urban, for allowing a trespassing musician into their anthropological sandbox, so to speak. Hearing heat is a buzz with sound resonating spatially and temporally dispersed entanglements of voicings and soundings by, and hearings and overhearings of, living and non-living coexistence. This extraordinary virtual installation works with, in, and through its two basic elements, heat, hearing, but pushing us into a perhaps unexpected intersensorial encounter with heat beyond a quickened pulse, shortened breath, and sweaty bodies. Hearing heat wants us to do precisely that, to hear it, to hear heat, or to hear to how heat has been heard, its histories of listening. It, hearing heat that is, works within and through these elements through an epistemological mediation, that is to say, with sound as a way of knowing and being, and under the carefully arranged set performed by cicadas since time immemorial. Past the remarkable overture by Martha Nevendelas, Walter Benjamin, and Dipesh Chakravarti, we encounter three stories registering in Steve Ward's quote, how cicadas sound as biopolitical archives, end quote. Set respectively in Bosavi, Papua New Guinea, first, second, post-World War II Japan, and third, a dialogic encounter between ancient and late 20th century Greece. Each story locates meetings between epistemology and the Anthropocene. That hyper-object linking the temporalities and the human and the geological, and one that I may add, for which human perception seems to be woefully inadequate. Small, perhaps, is the word. A rich lexicon drawn from, among others, phenomenology, anthropological linguistics, Melanesian anthropology, semiotics and biosemiotics, sonography and historiography, constellates expressions such as affecting voice, spectrality, phonesthetic, and intersensorial to perform its analytical work. At the end, we exit, so to speak, the installation's 3 rooms or more with some answers to Steve's question, which he makes explicit at the end, quote, what is the heat that I'm hearing, end quote. We also become alibis for a recomposition of anthropological decompositions that had previously conceptualized culture as a species hierarchy, his words, and installed a no longer sustainable division between nature and culture, precisely under the pressures of not just anthropological expiation, but a collapsing world. Now, world or worlds. I put it in stark binary terms because part of what makes hearing heat's intermediality so compelling is its remix of the plurality of expressions for the creative capacity of societies everywhere to configure their world. Put in words borrowed from a certain strand of anthropological thought, we witness various forms of actively producing ontologies. And by ontology, I mean simply with Patrice Manigliere, quote, the way in which something can be determined as a being, end quote. Be it, pun intended, an atom, a forest, a breath, a unicorn, a relation, and so on. This, of course, renders the naturalistic concept of nature unstable and affords us a thinking and a hearing beyond representations by different, quote, cultures of a, quote, fixed reality. And if Marilyn Strathern, as Marilyn Strathern puts it, societies coalesce around the way people draw analogies between different domains of the worlds. The stories of hearing heat ask that we compare each of their comparisons. We may almost replace comparison with relation here. We are relating to forms of relation. I feel that hearing heat makes an eloquent case for how in each story, sounding and hearing mediates a comparison or establish a relation between existence, human and otherwise. For example, Ulahi's attunement to the sonic frequencies of cicadas synesthetically herald a political ecology, those are Steve's words, in which, as he hears it, quote, nature is the memory of the world, end quote. In also Yasuhiro's film Tokyo Story, the character Keizo refuses the mixture of Buddhist ritual soundings and cicada songs for how it makes him feel that his mother, recently deceased, quote, is becoming smaller bit by bit, end quote. In a sentence, Keizo disavows both Buddhist reincarnation, a matter of the future, and a recent past that had already sounded the death knell at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With cicadas as the first to hear the unprecedented heat of atomic radiation, 10,832 degrees Fahrenheit. The questions that emerge from these are perhaps obvious, but I want to ask them. And I now realize that these resonate with Kristina's own. How do we establish a dialogue between and across these worlds, between and across these biological archives, between and across these listenings to histories of listening? But differently, should we file these archives under a general archive marked, quote, the world, or, quote, nature, or, quote, Gaia, that may afford us all a collaborative engagement with the common thread of the Anthropocene? Or to take a Benjaminian opening, in hearing, are we looking for an equivalent word in another language, a translation? Or are we looking for and hearing different worlds to which the same intersensory entanglement refers? A corollary question follows. Having experienced the possibilities of intermedial teasing, as Steve puts it, inspired by a graduate student from his seminar this semester here at Penn, what may emerge as commensurable and incommensurables in, with, and across hearing? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jairo. Greg, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I do have to say up front, that I have this huge admiration for Steve's aesthetic sensibility, and I think it's just, terrifically manifested in this intermedial project. And in the interest of full disclosure, and Steve and I talked about this, but I have to say that Steve and I have been really close friends for more than 3 decades now. So it's really just a pleasure to be able to, once again, comment on Steve's work. And for those of you who don't know anything about me in relationship to Steve, one of the things that might give you a clue is the fact that in some of our emails, we address each other as Beavis and Butthead. And I'll let you try to decide which you think is which. In any case, I would like to first mention a little bit about how I actually approached these 3 different archives, really 5 different segments of the video. And I did, as Kristina did, once through. She said she did a couple more once throughs. But then what I did is, what I think the linguistic anthropologist tendency is to do is to, go to the time code and view everything, take copious notes on each part, and try to understand something about the qualities of voice and also the semantic representation of the world that Steve was giving us. And in that process, I spent several days, and it was a very slow meander till I finally got through the whole tape. But in the process of that, what really stood out for me was the question of my own affective response. And my comments are going to really press the limits of being completely solipsistic, but I think they do have to do with the interface between my own personal history, my relationship to Steve over several decades, and also the content of Steve's words, publicly accessible to everyone here, and of the qualities of sound and visual imagery that Steve provides us with. And I have to say that I did resist the temptation as a linguistic anthropologist to do pitch tracks of Steve's voice as we go through the entire narration from beginning to end. As I do wonder that, I had the sense that the pitch was declining gradually in a microtonal decline by the time we reach the end. And I'll tell you why I think that's interesting, actually. It may not be true, but why I think it's interesting. So focusing on my own responses, and by the way, a question that I also asked myself after finishing all this listening is, what would it have been like had it been an installation? You know, Steve mentioned that it would be in several rooms and hallways. What would go where, and how would we be walking through or understanding and listening to and watching? So with that, I'll just, you know, plunge you right into the heart of my thinking about this. And that is, I really focused on Steve's statement that what he gave us is an intermedial remix as a politics of amplification. Those are his words. And about how he's making audible how a reckoning with affective voice is equally a reckoning with capitalist and eco-political acceleration. This is one of the things that really interests me. What is this reckoning with the voice, and what is the reckoning with this capitalist and eco-political acceleration? And so the question I really posed to myself was, you know, what was the affective coherence of this piece for me? And I'd be interested to hear what it is for everyone else also, to have some discussion with that. So I'll just start in with these random observations that came out of this intense listening experience, and start really with Martha and the Vandellas. And Steve right there at the beginning tells us afterwards that we can experience the pitch of this, the rising pitch at the beginning as we move into the heat wave, which, as most linguistic anthropologists will know, is a form of intensification that brings about a kind of excitement. And I did feel the excitement, and this song goes back to my youth. And so it really rekindled that time in my life. And I remember very clearly this song. But then there was actually a jarring quality to watching the video of Martha and the Vandellas performing to this white audience outside of London, and the tameness of their gestures, the dance movements, really hit me, because my experience at that time was one of much more liberation. In that context in which they're performing, of course, is relevant to understanding that. But what that did for me was it created a kind of distance between the nostalgia for an earlier part of my life and the actual representation of it in the visual portion as juxtaposed with the actual song itself. So temporal distance, nostalgia, desire, longing, however you want to call it, in that opening segment, but for me, the takeaway being an aspect of excitement about the project that Steve was embarking on. And I'm gonna, you know, jump right into the middle part of this, because as with Kristina, I was really hit with the case of Japan, Hiroshima, the bombing. This has really an important resonance with a component of my life back in the 1980s, when I was not only working on issues in the Amazon parallel to Steve's work in New Guinea, but I also got involved in teaching courses about and analyzing and writing about nuclear war discourse. And so the kindling of that, I remember I had been in Brazil for a year, and when I came back, I read Jonathan Chell's The Fate of the Earth, which is all about the horror of complete annihilation on the planet. And I see now very clearly its connection to the acceleration of capitalist and eco-political acceleration to which Steve points in his commentary. So what hit me about this, firstly, I was similarly to what I experienced with Martha and the Vandellas, taken with the sort of nostalgic component in regard to my own life, the scenes from the Ozu's movie, and especially in relationship to the styles of clothing that were present and the kind of mannerisms and so forth. While Japanese, they were similar to the styles of my parents' generation, kind of wearing suits and the kind of dress that people had and so forth. So it called that up for me. But then what really hit me was the tolling of the Pagoda bell, 3 minutes and 25 seconds worth of tolling of the Pagoda bell with the buzzing of the cicadas, and then abruptly stopping in a period, I couldn't believe when I went back later and measured it, that it was a period of only 1 minute of silence, but I felt like it had really hit me like an eternity. I've never had such a loud experience of silence. I kept having flashbacks to the idea of the complete annihilation of the human species at nuclear war that we're looking at now with things like climate change and so forth. So it's a personal experience of it, but I wonder how others experience that 1 minute of sound that appeared in the middle of the video. And actually, the words that came to my mind I don't remember after how many listenings to this, but were from Max Weber in his writings about bureaucracy. And in particular, the phrase that many of you will know, the polar night of icy darkness. That for me was the synesthetic association with that. So in any case, my involvement with that, of course, led me to contact with the people in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who, as you know, have a doomsday clock. And by the way, that doomsday clock is now about 100 seconds from midnight. So it's a really powerful set of feelings for me. The segments with Ulahi, I felt my kinship with Steve, doing similar kinds of research at the same time. So the powerful feelings of belonging, which also go along with the, the kind of anti-nuclear movement that took place during the 1980s. And then I got to the piece about Greece and Xenakis's choral in this stochastic humming, almost cicada-like, of these different voices, mixing, weaving in and out and so forth. The thing that occurred to me most was this sense of how scary it was. And in particular, the image came to me of Edvard Munch's The Scream, only I saw thousands of these faces before me as I listened to this. So lastly, to try to wrap this up a little bit, that the ending with Maria Elena Walsh's piece, Como la cigarra, Steve talks about it in terms of hopefulness. The hopefulness for me was more like Lauren Berlant's assertion, we refuse to be worn out, that the cicada keeps being reborn. Sorry about that. So I didn't really feel it as hopelessness in quite that way. I felt it as melancholy, a melancholy voice. And in this regard, I do feel that there's something similar about what Steve is pointing to and what happened in the course of the anti-nuclear movement back in the 1980s that did eventually lead to a winding down at that point of the atomic, pushing back of midnight on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists clock. So the question for me is there an aesthetic coherence? Should it have an aesthetic coherence? And I did find one for myself, and that was the movement from this excitement initiated by Martha and the Vandellas to this idea of being together with others and with nature in Ulahi's song, to the horror at the Hiroshima story and the whole idea of the atomic bombing of an innocent population, to the collective fright of Xenakis's Nui, and finally to the melancholy of Maria Elena Walsh. So that's the arc as I conceptualized it, and I'd be interested if Steve had a different idea about the arc or whether he thought about that from the point of view of the affective coherence. So thank you again, Steve, and also to Jairo and to Kristina for their comments.
Thanks so much, all three of you, for opening up different avenues for discussion. I want to invite Steve now to respond to these provocations, and then we'll open up for a broader discussion.
How many semesters do we have?
Yeah, you can always come.
Well, first, Deborah, thank you so much for your extraordinarily generous invitation, both the invitation to come to Penn and also your introduction, and to Christina, Jairo, and Greg for deep diving into this piece. This is, as Deborah mentioned, the Penn semester was meant as a homecoming, and maybe it's most appropriate that on the screen are people who I met at Annenberg in 1980, who were students in the Annenberg Film Lab and have now gone on to do all sorts of extraordinary things, as well as people who are on the screen in front of me who were part of that crowd at Austin who nicknamed Greg and I Beavis and Butthead. And yeah, I'll leave it to you to imagine who's who. And and also my closest friend and colleague and the person who took me to listen to cicadas in Papua New Guinea all of those years ago, Bambi Shefflin, who's joined us as well. These are really rich responses. I can put the check in the mail tomorrow, but to really deliver on all the things that you brought up would, that would take a book. But I just love Kristina bringing it to a head with the question of, of really can listening embrace activism, or what kind of cicadas, what kind of invitation are the cicadas for some kind of reparative action? There are 3,300 known species of cicadas, and you listen to about 6 of them in this piece. So, the first thing that, kind of blows me away is just to think about, well, what are all of those other histories of listening and all of those other ways that this, that these 3 stories would dovetail with so many others through time and space, and, linking the history of the senses to the history of the arts to the history of technologies. The stakes in acoustic cohabitation that Kristina asked about, I think, really invites us into exploring those ways that the kinds of histories that are called natural histories are also histories of attraction and danger, histories of horror, and histories of profound beauty. And in all of the stories that I tell, there's a relationship between attraction and danger. And in the histories of listening to this world, the question that Kristina kind of raises for me is, what is the place of reparative action in this kind of rub between the attraction and the danger? And, if we focus only on the danger, are we just committing to a sort of sledgehammer way of thinking about this history? And if we commit just to the poesis and our attraction to it and the wonder of dancing with Martha and the Vandellas and, and the heat raining down, I mean, the histories of wonder are amazing, but how do we connect the histories of wonder with these histories of profound horror? And I don't really have a great answer to it. I just think that remix and politics of amplification through remix, and thinking about new forms of playlists, and that's anthropological playlists and visual playlists and sonic playlists, is one of the ways to really imagine DJing our way into activist listening or reparative listening. And, Jairo intensifies that by talking about the, bringing in Marilyn Strathern and, that whole history of Marilyn and Roy and all those New Guinea folks who I love so much, introducing us to ideas about, analogism and difference, and the dialogue across worlds, and the way in which relations with materials and relations with spirits are just as important for Papua New Guineans as relations with other humans. And I think that the question of commensurability is really a question of how seriously are we going to take this word, relationality, when we do, all of the serious work, both on decomposition. And I have to say, I'm very sorry that I only just 2 days ago actually received Kristina's book, and I'm also at the moment reading another one called Decomposed, which is about the political ecology of vinyl and what the energy history of vinyl and CDs and record making actually says about political ecology. So I would love to engage decomposition much more in this particular piece. But going back to those 3,300 species, what would it take to create a generation of biologists and natural historians who really took affect as a serious or central part of the way they do natural history, or write about, or research or understand these affective relations with cicadas? And what would it take to educate a generation of music historians? I mean, when I went to music conservatory, the ear training didn't include bird call recognition or cicada recognition. I had to go to the rainforest to get that kind of conservatory training. 4 years in a conservatory, and I never heard a bird or never heard anything other than, Western musical instruments. So in terms of affective response and, affective coherence and the importance of silence in this piece, that 1 minute of silence, which for me was, one of the most important commitments of making the piece, was to really think about where and how and what was the most appropriate way to insist on silence. This, I think, does relate very closely to what Greg's saying about intensification as excitement. In popular music, there's a history of using ascending sound sequences and key modulations to exactly do this. Any of you who are familiar with Stevie Wonder knows that, he's one of the great key modulators in the last, sections of his song. And that extraordinary tribute to Stevie Wonder and the Jackson 5 that Beyonce did, Love on Top, includes 4 ascending key modulations. In the video, each one is accompanied by a change of costumes, ending on an extraordinary, E major thing, which is hard enough to do musically, but she's singing an octave above the band. I mean, talk about on top. It just keeps rising and rising and rising. It is a spectacular story, piece of sonic intensification and excitement. For me, the nostalgia and melancholy stuff is always there in the histories of attraction as much as it is in the histories of destruction. And I think that Greg's bringing up the scream of Munch, and we could talk about a lot of other visual art that works in here. If I had done an installation, what I would have added in was I'm working with a photographic historian. There's a book called Flash of Light, actually, which is composed just put out recently by the University of Texas Press. It consists entirely of photographs of Hiroshima by Japanese photographers who were documenting it on the spot. And this work had, long not appeared. And the photographs are absolutely extraordinary. And I would want to bring, some of those in and develop the collaboration that I've done in Japan so that more of that visual material could be could be available. I've already said too much, but you know, the final thing I do want to say here is at CASBIS in 2016, 2017, I was supposed to write a book about voice in Papua New Guinea. And I thought I'll start out by writing a chapter about the world being in the mouth and about the phonesthesia and the intersensorial world of ulahi and the cicadas, and singing with birds, singing to, with, and about birds, water, insects, and so forth in Papua New Guinea, and what it teaches us about relationality. And I hadn't been at a real library for a long time. And after like a month in the Stanford Library in the fall of 2016, I realized that, you know, I wasn't going to write this book. I was only going to write a book and, you know, produce a work that was about cicadas and voice. I just became so overwhelmed by the amount of extraordinary history here. So it's, you know, the inspiration of all of that, you know, is perhaps one way of saying that when I get brought into the most horrible side of all this history, I can still see over and over and over again how the history of voice is also, you know, a history of attraction and listening throughout all that danger. And that's why I did want to end, whether you read that performance and that song as resistance, or whether you read it as hope, or whether you read it as nostalgia, or whether you have a hard time figuring out, you know, where it sits in relation to these other stories. That idea of regeneration and the observation of, you know, like that coming out from the soil is like coming back from the war, and putting those images together in that song that remains extraordinarily powerful for me.
Thanks, Steve. So I want to take moderator's privilege, I guess, and open up with a question. And if anyone else, and I'm sure you do, has questions, you can use the little raise your blue hand button under participants. And then we'll know to call on you, and then we'll help you unmute yourself when it is time. So I really appreciate all three of your remarks, and Steve, also your responses. And it forced me to think again about my affective experience of it, which I said to Kristina the other day. I have never liked cicadas. And as a kid in Jamaica, I always used to wish that they would just stay underground, because they were so hard and they would swarm and they would inevitably, you know, hit me in the face. And it just, as you were speaking and as I was watching the different aspects of the film, I was really struck by the question of time, actually. And in a way, this kind of brings us back to some of the questions that were raised last week with Christina Knight's and her sister Jessie Knight's presentation. But it, you know, it was putting together a couple questions that you raised. One had to do with the tempo of cicadas, and especially in the score with ulahi, singing with them. And the other had to do with what Jairo reminded us of, is to think about cicadas as a biopolitical archive. So I was thinking then about memory, time, and archive, and how ironic that is, in a way, for a being that spends such a tiny proportion of their time alive on the planet above ground. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that phenomenon, you know, the kind of temporality of the cicada and the kind of archive that can be when so little of its life is sort of above ground. What kind of an archive of the earth is it? What kind of memory is that really inducing for us?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. There's definitely much more both biological and cultural and artistic inspiration that's really been about the space of cicadas and not so much about the time of cicadas. Except if you follow anime, there's a great deal actually about this. And cicadas take on the character, and I think also in a lot of different kinds of literature that I could mention, there's the temporality emphasizes not so much the coming out of ground, but the idea that in the short period of time amongst others, that there's this kind of drunkenness on light and heat, and this kind of, and it's so fascinating that this is the aspect that, you know, is focused on in the Phaedrus and in the dialogue, and that that, you know, that the cicadas wasted away because they forgot to, you know, eat and drink. And there's a, you know, whether you look at French mythology or, I mean, there's many kinds of mythology that take note of this idea that, you know, cicadas become so crazed with sounding, heat and light that they don't pay any attention to themselves. And it becomes a kind of cautionary tale about what happens if you sing too much, or what happens if you dance too much, or what happens if you're too drunk, or if, you know, what happens if, so it becomes a kind of parable about excessiveness that is taken on over and over again in various kinds of proverbs and literature and folklore and things like that. So but I'm trying to think if there's anything that really addresses the relationship between that tempo and the specificity of the danger of, you know, literally blowing yourself out, blowing yourself up in a month to 6 weeks because, you know, you're just too high on the sun and too high on the heat. The biological thing about cicadas is that, you know, they would be killing themselves a lot faster if their mechanism was different, right? I mean, they have something which, you know, like imagine that we had some kind of thing that just shot out of the sides of our head and cupped around our ears so that every time we sang, we didn't kill ourselves. We didn't, you know, annihilate ourselves just at the by sound penetration and decibels. So this idea that the voice is both outside of the body because it's an exterior sound-making mechanism, but the idea that the hearing mechanism itself is one of the most extraordinarily protected in all species because the sound is so intense that literally they would kill themselves very quickly.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Can I invite you all to chime in and become part of the discussion? Who would like to ask a question? Could put something in the chat, or again, raise the blue hand. Okay. I'm not sure I'm going to say her name properly, but I'm going to say Lendi.
It's an email address and I couldn't change it, unfortunately. My name is Lisa Henderson, and I'll try not to be too old home week about this, but with Barry Dornfeld, who's also in the audience, we were at Annenberg with Steve in the early 80s. And I haven't seen the piece, Steve. I've seen the components of the piece when you used to illustrate the paper on Hearing Heat with those components. But I haven't been able to get to the film yet, but I know the components. And my partly solipsistic response to this is through the auditory experience of tinnitus, which has a heat component. If you have tinnitus and you live with cicadas in your head, the hotter it gets, the brighter gets the cicada sound. And there's a war connection to that because tinnitus is it's probably the primary injury that people in combat experience from sound exposure. So I'm always reminded of wartime sound exposure in that other context. And by the way, Steve Tom Streeter, who you know, often refers to my inner Beatus. So I'm curious if I get that from you too, along with so much else. But my question to you now is about connecting two pieces of yours that I know well, Hearing Heat, and also a much earlier from the late 90s, Pygmy Pop, A Genealogy of Schizophonic Mimesis. And the question I have in the comparison of those two pieces is just about mobility and sort of radical recontextualization as part of your cosmopolitanism, I guess. Because in the Pygmy Pop piece, you follow a Cameroonian flute sound, Hindu, through time and space, you know, from Herbie Hancock recordings to Neutrogena ads and Madonna recordings and Deep Forest. I mean, there's so many stops along the way of this Cameroonian flute sound. And cicadas, you do something similar with too, you know, brightly recontextualized in time and place and between wonder and horror, and Hindu between, I always thought of it as between extraction and generativity. And so I just wanted you to comment on that figure in your work, which is this pulling a sound through history, through time and place, and through both possibility and foreclosure, and see if you recognize your work in that, in my description that way.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Well, when I think about methods for listening to histories of listening, I often think about and quote Sonny Rollins when he was asked about his year on the Williamsburg Bridge, you know, retreating from nightclubs and recordings and everything else and just going out and standing on the bridge and practicing and practicing and practicing before he came back and said that he had finally had something to say. He was asked, well, what did you learn from that year on the bridge? And he said, I learned to wring every ounce of melody out of a note. And I love the idea of, you know, that I love the intersensorial idea of ringing. I mean, WR, you know, like, you know, when you take a wet wash rag or something like that and you turn it and you just get all of that water out of it until it gets to be the way you want it. Or, you know, with heat or cold, you know, just, and that idea that applied to melody, that applied to voice, that applied to sound. It seems to me that that's what, you know, that's a central inspiration for how to do histories of listening, to think about, Sonny Rollins on the bridge for a year, learning to ring every ounce of melody out of those notes. So whether it's following histories of recording and histories of schizophonic mimesis, or following other kinds of histories of phonesthesia and sonesthesia, like the ones that are offered and juxtaposed here, I think that, up against methods of certain kinds of methods of historiography, methods of radical recontextualization and radical rejuxtaposition and remix and amplification and playlist are, that's me channeling Sonny Rollins.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Yeah, and what I got from those juxtapositions that you present us with in the film was the intention toward repair. Like, to me, that was the instantiation of that relational thinking and of what must be done. The response ability of what must be done is to imagine these disparate settings, these disparate times as one, right? Robin Riskin,
Yeah, thank you.
Has a question.
Hi, Steve. It's beautiful to see you here. And my parents are also watching too. I wanted to thank all of you again for another amazing program. And Steve, I had to ask you, this was actually really special for me, hearing and following your work here. And I'll have to go back to watch the film. But knowing you from your working context in Ghana and the incredible artists and different artists and musical polyphonic communities that you've introduced me to there. And then hearing more here and following more here about how you're really mixing materials and making playlists and thinking of your work as a kind of DJing, and knowing already your sensitivity to other artist practices and how generously you've been collaborating with them over the years. I myself, as a curator, I'm curious, how do you think of your own work as a kind of curatorial practice?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I think that one way of thinking about remix is also thinking about reconfigurations of curation, and curation itself as reparation, curation itself as particular acts of ways of repaying the generosities that you've resounded to. I mean, how could I ever repay 25 years of listening to Lahi's voice? How could I possibly bring some justice to the way in which that voice and the depth and the profound world of those poetics, and the way that her history of listening to water and cicadas and birds and forests, and bringing that alive in her voice, bringing that world to me and to other listeners through her voice. What do I do to amplify that? How can I do that? I mean, at first I thought the idea was you amplify these things quite literally by making recordings of them and writing essays about them, and bringing these things to the world. And now my thinking, and it's obviously has something to do with my age. My thinking is that I've got to find some ways to do that beyond the pleasures and the challenges and the extraordinary rewards of doing 25 years of ethnography there, or hanging out in Ghana for 15 years and knowing some of the same, amazing people that and having a chance to work with them and to, enjoy the pleasures of seeing that work reach, a larger world of interlocutors and audiences. The generosity that they share with us, making it, much more legible for others. And so I think, I've learned this in different kinds of ways in Accra and in Papua New Guinea. There's something that really attracts me right now to doing something like this. I mean, I love the attraction to, I'm not a historian of Motown, but I can't tell you how much in the last 4 years I've spent so much more time listening to that history and attending to that, listening to, how that profound baritone saxophone scoop by Mike Terry, interacting with the bass part by James Jamerson, and how it just fueled, not just the Martha and the Vandellas songs, but, so many, Dancing in the Street, Jimmy Mack, Nowhere to Run, all the other ones beside Heatwave, but, how much work it did for, on, Baby Love and so many of the Supreme songs, and what that sounding was. And of course, I try to connect it to the urgency of what 1963 was, 1963, starting with George Wallace becoming governor of Alabama and screaming, at the courthouse, segregation now, segregation forever, and ending with Sam Cooke singing "A Change Is Going to Come," or ending with, Malcolm X's Detroit speech, Kenya's independence, and then, what, I mean, so like a micro history, something like Heatwave being released in the in July of 1963, and like 2-3 weeks later, the I Have a Dream speech, and then the graduation of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi, or the or in September the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. So how the history of Heatwave, articulates with the history of Alabama in 1963, how you could juxtapose these two timelines, take something that looks like a Billboard chart of 1963 and take something that looks like a political timeline of the, and ask yourself, what the hell were we dancing to? I mean, Greg and I were 14 years old then, and I remember the heat. But I also remember that heat was the word we used both for guns and for police. I remember that, I grew up in Philly. Philadelphia was just beginning one of its most horrible, on top of horrible moments, because in the end of 1963, Frank Rizzo became the deputy commissioner of police. And in 1964, in the Columbia Avenue riots, and then in 1965 with the 7-month protests at Girard College over the admission of Black students. He's got dogs and horses charging at people. Reports are coming out saying that, Black Philadelphia is 20% of the population, and 90% of the murders by police are of Black men. I mean, this is talk about heat. It was a really heavy moment. So how do you remix all that stuff? And I think that, that listening also affords this kind of generosity. It gives me, listening to Martha and the Vandellas and listening to 1963 and, and the love of the heat wave and the innocence of the heat wave and the fun of dancing and making those gestures, with the heat wave are also part of, the horror of the heat of the summer of 1963. And, and how do you, what does it take to bring those things together? And, and I think that really resounds powerfully with, what, Deborah and Kristina were both saying about, where's the reparative, action that you can connect to the history of listening and connect to the history of hearing.
I'm so glad that you fleshed that out, because it turned very differently evocative for me. And I just wanted to remind everybody, in case you came a little late, that the hearing heat that we're speaking about will be available for you to watch. And I just put the link and the password in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to see it as yet, you can do so. We have a question from someone whose Zoom name is Ever.
Piali, Nanotoka Ever. Hello, my name is Ever. I'm a little nervous, but I would regret not asking this question because it's a really good topic. So John Coltrane once said that anybody could play anything. One can play a shoestring if they had, I guess, enough enthusiasm to do so. And I was just wondering, for scholars who are starting off, for those of us who see a shoestring and think of it in ways that are maybe sonic, or even see a redwood tree or a piece of literature and really want to know how it hums, I was just wondering, given your career and everything, what advice you would give for people who see connections maybe of music and objects or of things in a different light. Thank you, Paskamati.
Yeah. I don't know if, thank you for the question. I don't know if I have any advice, but I can just tell you that, you know, the pleasure of listening and the visceral intensity of listening and the activity of listening only becomes more and more a link between intensification and excitement for me. And you know, most of the ideas that I had in this piece came to me while I was wearing headphones. And frankly, I'm inspired by that. And so if I have any advice, it's, you know, put your headphones on for a while and then take them off for a while. I mean, you know, the idea of finding ways to bring the listening closer and, you know, insist that we can't take listening for granted, whether it's, you know, stuff we're listening to for the beauty of it, or stuff we're listening to because we need to hear more history. We need to hear more, you know, we need to hear more about, you know, what might have been going on in the shaping of those voices and those moments. And I think, you know, it was a really important point that Greg brought up about the, you know, the 80s and this connection between these eras and periods and particular, you know, the affective moods. And, you know, just think about what happened the first time you saw Dr. Strangelove. Did you think that you would go and see it again? Did you think you would listen to the soundtrack again? Did you think that, you know, you would do, you know, what Greg Urban did as a smart linguistic anthropologist of saying, okay, what's really going on here on this soundtrack? You know, not just what are people saying in some kind of film criticism kind of way, but, you know, what is the materiality of the voice in relation to those images that create that? What shapes a discursive arena at a particular moment? So, you know, whether it's the anti-nuclear one or, you know, the one that in Greece around austerity was called the Mercury of Indignation, referring to heat waves, or, you know, the heat wave of Martha and the Vandellas and the connection between love being like a heat wave and, you know, horrible summer histories with cops is like a heat wave too. And, you know, and how do, you know, in every era, whether it's the 60s or the 80s or the 70s or whatever, you know, what does it mean to, you know, like bracket some stuff, put on the headphones and, like, you know, find those moments that crystallize those those things.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time. I know Greg wants to make a short comment, and I see Barry Dornfeld has his little blue hand up with a question. And now Martin has popped up with a quick question as well. So I'm wondering if, Greg, we can take your comment. Barry and Martin, we can take both of your questions. We can turn it back to Steve, and then I'll just close this out, okay?
So I just really had a quick follow-up to Steve's remarks just now, but also Deb, to what you and Kristina were mentioning about repair, because what I was trying to raise, but didn't do it quite effectively, Steve just did now, the notion that the voice is actually linked to these social movements. And for me, the arc I was trying to chart of the affect is linked to the arc that I experienced also during the anti-nuclear period. And, you know, I was young during the time of the civil rights movement, but I think there are certain similarities to these arcs because of the way in which they accumulate and give rise to social movements that do affect change in the world. So that's just a little comment.
Okay, go ahead, Barry.
And I'll make my comment brief. Hi, Deborah, nice to see you again. And Steve, you know, it was interesting. I was disappointed, of course, when you couldn't come to Philadelphia, because I was hoping to have time to spend with you here. And then also thinking about this, you know, this presentation having to be mediated, as, you know, initially felt a little disappointed there too, instead of being able to hear you give the talk or see it installed. But actually, in listening to it earlier today, you know, I was struck by something that the medium kind of a possibility that it offered up that was different than it would be, you know, if it was a talk or an installation. And it just made me think about not only, you know, the way you juxtapose image and sound from these different contexts, but also your voice, right? So your voice is part of that in a particular way, in a particular performance and recording, and, you know, something that I've been listening to for many years as well, as a student of yours many years ago. But it just made me think about how not only, you know, have you sort of given us this way of sort of thinking about sound and you know, sort of thinking about the meaning of sound, but thinking sort of through sound. And, you know, that really struck me was that, you know, you help us think about sound as a kind of primary way of not only experiencing the world, but also analyzing the world. So that's just something that I was reminded by through this piece and through the talk. And I just wanted to appreciate that in hearing it.
Thanks. Martin, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I don't know if this is an appropriate last question, but I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to everybody. Steve, I'm just so moved. You're blowing my mind here, though. I mean, right now, half of my teaching is related to the environmental humanities, and the other half is related to jazz. And you are once again showing me you know, the path for putting these seemingly incommensurate worlds together. So I'd like to thank you for that. I had a quick question about the Cicadas Biopolitical Archive and the relation, I guess, that archives have to time. So when I think about it, archives, you know, purport to capture a present that becomes a past at the moment of capture, but they also are always oriented toward the future in that they presume a future reader or researcher or listener. But here it seems like there's a more kind of radical kind of futurity at play, in that the cicada as archive is on the move and on the wane, and is archiving a changing environment and giving us a kind of sounded half-life that lets us hear not just history, but it's precarious, our precarious future. So I guess my question is, do you think that all archives secretly work this way, or is there something distinctive about a biopolitical or ecological or precarious archive like this one that you know that makes it that makes the future audible to us? So basically, can you just kind of riff a little bit on archives in time?
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I don't know that I could make a huge generalization about this, Martin, but obviously what's attracted me to working on listening to the cicada stories is, you know, I'm deeply moved by this trope that something that spends so much time killing itself also spends so much time reinventing itself. That, you know, these cycles of 6 and 7 years and as much as 16 years, you know, under the ground, and, you know, just this long period of coming out and emerging, and then just, you know, really, you know, partying out big time and just, you know, blowing the whole thing out in a month. You know, what is it that, you know, needs to be learned by listening to the history of how people have narrated that, how people have listened to it, how people have sung it, how people have, you know, brought it into, I mean, why does Xenakis, you know, connect that to political prisoners and to ancient phonemes? You know, what was, I mean, you know, that's an extraordinary artistic vision in that moment, and a piece of music that's as intense as any that I know. You know, how to go with that, but at the same time, how to go with this, you know, also as a story about phonogenesis, and why are we attracted to these things that have certain kinds of histories? And obviously, you know, we're projecting all kinds of human, you know, relational business into this. You know, and so this is why I'm attracted to, you know, what Philippe Descartes says in The Ecology of Others about recomposition. I mean, I take recomposition in the direction of remix here, because I think that's one way to deal with the archive. You know, making it a counter archive. A remixed out archive is a counter archive, and that, I think, is a way of doing a certain kind of political business, or a certain kind of, or at least posing, you know, certain kinds of questions. And, you know, to what Barry said, and what we've done this semester in this, you know, this really wonderful group of students I've had the privilege to be talking to at Penn, is, you know, think about, okay, what if it's not just about media, but what if we focus on the inter part of the intermedia, and not just think about doing something that's, you know, in sound or in images or in text or in voice or in performance or something like that. What is the inter as the real, you know, the real stuff of amplification, the real stuff that might be the radical part of media practice or creative practice with media. So, you know, all of that has led me, you know, Greg calls it the arc of vocal materiality, or something like that. And, you know, absolutely, it is the arc of affect and the arc of affective relating. You know, it really strikes me that notion of affecting voice that Merleau-Ponty came up with in 1954 has not, you know, seen a kind of explosive, you know, set of re-engagements in the world of scholarship about affect. Because, you know, connecting voice, you know, the primary site of agency, and, you know, affecting this, you know, which is now, you know, exploding as in terms of our understanding of social movements, seems that, you know, he was really onto something very important, and went far beyond his larger, you know, the general thinking that it was placed in, the thinking about embodiment.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Anyway, you all are on the East Coast. You need to go eat dinner.
Indeed, our time is becoming circumscribed. And I think I just want to sort of end this by saying how much I have been inspired by the depth of the listening. I think the slow listening, by which I mean listening without immediate intention. And my friend Tao Goff talks, she's a DJ, she's a scholar and a DJ, and she always talks about her practice as a DJ as time travel, right? And in a way, that's what you allowed us to do with this piece. And so I really appreciate you sharing it with us and sharing the semester with us and your incredible generosity of spirit and scholarship and relation with other people, engaging collaborative life together. It's lovely to see, and it's a lovely model for our students, our faculty, and everybody else. I want to thank also Christina Lyons, Jairo Moreno, and Greg Urban for sharing their thoughts with us, and Elisa Jordan, who's our postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Experimental Ethnography, who has set all of this up and has been an enduring presence, both in the seminar and beyond. And also Annie Lindner, our administrative assistant, who has really been with us from the start. She's graduating this semester and we will miss her miserably. And thank all of you for coming and for joining us. A reminder that the link is in the chat if you want to see it, if you haven't had a chance to see it. And I wish you all a wonderful end of the semester. Bye.